So I don't exactly know.
Yeah, so I apologize if this is a bit of a change of gear. This has been a fascinating session, and I'll try and keep this as, make sure it doesn't get too dry. But I want to talk generally about a project which we're doing at the moment at NCAR, which is to assess the impacts which can be avoided by taking a moderate mitigation strategy like RCP 4.5 instead of a business as usual strategy like RCP 8.5, and how the avoided impacts and the cost of those avoided impacts might relate to the cost of the mitigation itself. There is to be a special issue associated with this, a number of papers on a diverse range of subjects, from sea level rise to difference in hurricanes to difference in crop yields and extreme events. And to do well, all of these, we need some GCM results. Half the work for this was done already by a pre-existing project at NCAR, the so-called large ensemble, which Clara Dessa and Jen Kay have been heavily involved in producing, and we're very grateful to have access to that data. And secondly, because we're doing a comparison of two different scenarios, we needed at least some simulations with a mitigation scenario. So we created, whereas the large ensemble is 40 members, we created a 15-member initial, a 15-member RCP 4.5 ensemble with which we could compare it. And what's plotted here is just the global evolution of these two ensembles from 2005 until 2018. The question that I want to ask today is, well, these things are very expensive to run, and is it necessarily the best use of our time to do very large initial condition ensembles to address the problem of initial condition variability? Or could we get away with fewer and predict what the result of the larger ensemble would look like? So one thing which is undeniably true is that that initial conditions matter. So Clara's paper in 2012 showed that if you look over regions which are below the synoptic scale, that the differences in trends which we can observe in climate variables over the next 50 years with exactly the same model can differ massively depending on initial condition differences between two simulations. And so this is taking two extreme values for trends in the United States over an initial condition ensemble. You can get a trend of less than 1 Kelvin or greater than 4 Kelvin, depending on which member you choose. So that's interesting. It's greater than many people might have expected, and it's certainly it's changed the emphasis in how the runs and the requirements of simulations at computing centers are allocated, in that there's now a much greater realization that we need to potentially run more members of a given scenario in order to sample the uncertainty. And so this is relevant not only internally, but for the IPCC process as a whole, as we go forward into CMIP 6. And we're designing how we should allocate our resources through different scenarios, whether we should take the CMIP 5 strategy of allocating a small, maybe 5 to 10 members for each different scenario, and then running them out into the future, or should we put all of our eggs in one proverbial basket and then run a very small number of ensemble members with most of our scenarios, and then run a large ensemble with one? Now, in order to answer this question properly, we need to know two things. Firstly, if we're only going to run an initial condition ensemble with a single scenario, we need to know whether we can transfer that variability from one scenario to another. So can we take the variability which we have in RCP 8.5 and assume that we'd have the same variability around RCP 4.5 or RCP 2.6? This isn't necessarily clear. Does it change with model? Can we just run one initial condition ensemble with one model? Is that enough than to estimate the variability in any other model. And secondly, to what degree can we predict the behavior of a larger ensemble if we make some sensible statistical assumptions and fit distributions to the output of a smaller ensemble? So I'm not going to show all of the results here. I'm just going to show some illustrative results. But we can answer some of these questions with the two ensembles that we have. So certainly looking at the large scale, so large scale modes of variability. I've shown here the first global EOF, which really just looks like El Nino. And if you look at this as, this is an anomaly from the mean state, then you can't tell the difference between RCP 8.5 and 4.5. The ENSO variability looks the same. Interestingly, if you look at the previous version of CCSM, then there is a large difference in the variability. So model variability definitely changes a lot from one model to the next, but within the range of scenarios that we have, it doesn't change that much from one scenario to another. If you really push this to an extreme case, so if you go to very high forcing levels, greater than RCP 8.5, perhaps the types of global temperature which we might achieve in 2300, then we do see a change in ENSO variability. If you go to Nadia Erger's poster tomorrow, she can tell you more about that. But for the sake of variability in any climate which we're going to see in the next 100 years, in the model that we have, we don't see any difference. But at a small scale, that's not true. So, I'm showing the results from September to November here to illustrate that at a regional scale, we do see differences in variability. So in the Amazon, we see an enhancement of a soil moisture feedback, and so that gives us a greater variability in RCP 8.5 than we see in RCP 4.5, because any small changes which we had before are amplified. In the Arctic, RCP 8.5, basically none of the models have any sea ice by 2060. So that actually decreases the variability which you have in that scenario. And so there becomes a large difference between the variability in RCP 4.5, where depending on the year, you may have sea ice or you may not in September. In RCP 8.5, you never do. And so there's a large difference in variability there. So at a regional level, we see differences in variability between the two ensembles, but in terms of global modes of variability, we do not. And so to come to the second question, whether we can predict the variability of the large ensemble from a smaller ensemble, again, the answer is yes and no. So if we firstly think about long-term trends, and this is the way that these ensembles have been used so far, so 50, 55-year trends. And I've shown San Francisco here just to illustrate my point. There is a large, at the point scale, there is a large, the distribution is wide at this point. It's comparable to the signal of the warming which we're going to get over that period. But we don't actually need that many ensemble members to fit a distribution to the trend. So if you have 5 ensemble members, we already have a reasonably good idea what the standard deviation of the trend would be, even at the grid point level, for 50 years. If you have 10 members, you have a very good idea. So you don't need 40 members in order to answer that question. But as various people, as Klaus has pointed out today, as Eric pointed out yesterday, there are the interest in an ensemble like this, and the interest of any stakeholder is not really in the trend, in the 55-year trend. It's in the extreme events. It's in the right at the tails of the distribution. And although the tails of the distribution are, any individual grid point is unlikely to experience them, as Eric said yesterday, if you're a stakeholder, if you have a large enough portfolio, then somewhere in your portfolio, somewhere is going to experience the tails. And that's where these ensembles become really very powerful. So let's consider a sample question for which this might be interesting. So let's take a 1 in 100 year pluvial rain event. So this is when the annual precipitation is greater than 99% of the years which you would experience in a control simulation. And then let's look at the risk of that happening both in RCP 8.5 and in RCP 4.5. So points in green here, the risk is double. The points in blue, the risk is tripled or more of experiencing one of these events. And so this can be derived empirically from the large initial condition ensembles that we have. And so that's what's plotted here. And it's a little noisy. But we can also perhaps do better if we assume that we can fit a transient distribution or a distribution with non-stationary parameters to the precipitation distributions at a grid point level. So again, going to San Francisco. The black line shows the distribution of precipitation which you'd expect from the large ensemble in the present day. And the red line shows that the distribution which you'd expect between 2060 and 2080 in RCP 8.5. And so the model, with an ensemble as large as this, the model is fairly clear about what's going to happen. There are not going to be any years which are significantly drier than are experienced in the present day in the model. But the tail of the distribution shifts to the end. And so there are 2 points about this. Firstly, with precipitation, we can trivially say that we can't represent the variability as linearly additive to the mean because a Gaussian distribution just simply isn't appropriate for that variable. So any discussion that we'd have about that in terms of precipitation is effectively null. But the other thing which is interesting is this: even with a 30-member ensemble, we still don't know very much about the tails of this distribution. And so you almost have to fit, even with a large ensemble, you still have to fit a distribution, and you still have to make some pretty heroic assumptions about how that distribution changes over time. You effectively have to use a whole simulation and then fit 4 parameters with 30 members. However, if you do this, and we answer this, we ask again this question of what's the risk of this 100-year pluvial event in San Francisco, and then we use an increasing number of simulations in order to answer that. The black line shows the answer which we would get by fitting a distribution. The red line shows the answer we would get empirically just by counting events in the large ensemble. The red line hasn't converged yet. It's still all over the place. But the black line, with anything more than 5 or 6 simulations, we have a fairly good idea about what that change in risk is going to be. But this all comes with a word of caution, because we've made some assumptions there about what the distribution looks like. And although they may be approximately correct, when we're talking about the tails, that any assumptions which we've made about that distribution, any error in that distribution compared to what the distribution looks like in real life, can become really important. So let's just take one more case study. So this is, again, looking at, so these are maximum temperatures relative to the decadal mean. So this is one place where suddenly the variability between RCP 4.5 and 8.5 begins to look very, very different. So for instance, in the northeast of the US, relative to the decadal mean temperature which you get in RCP 8.5, the extreme warm events which you get are much warmer, even relative to that number. So we're seeing a large change in variability, which is only represented at the tails. And even if we fit, I'm taking London here as an example because it was a good one, but even if we fit an extreme value distribution to the maximum temperatures which are experienced relative to the mean experienced temperatures which we'd expect in 2070, if we fit 2 different mean extreme value distributions to both the RCP 4.5 and 8.5 distributions, we would expect the tail to shift by maybe 2 Kelvin. Whereas in fact, RCP 8.5, you get some extreme warm events, which wouldn't be, unless we had 30 members, unless we had this large initial condition ensemble to go with, there's no way we could have ever predicted that these events would occur. So the final conclusion is a complex one. Is there a point in running these ensembles? Yes. Can we predict some elements of them? Yes. Does the variability change as a function of scenario? Well, yes and no. So in order to come back to our original question of how should we spend our computing time for future experiments, whatever we do, we're going to miss out on something. And so we've probably I think this is a subject which we should, this is a discussion which we should have openly now, on whether we care about, and many people will care, about resolving very unlikely but very potentially expensive events, or whether we want to characterize the broad variability in a wide range of ensembles. And this is a discussion which we need to have. So thanks.